The summer of 1977 brought The Spy Who Loved Me to cinemas at a moment when Bond needed to be bigger than ever, and it delivered, with pyramids and submarines and one of cinema's most iconic villains who never said a single word. Here are the real lives behind it. Roger Moore stepped into the role of James Bond in 1973, already a household name, but it was The Spy Who Loved Me, his third outing as 007, that critics and fans most often point to as the film where his lighter, wittier Bond truly found its footing. He was 49 during filming, projecting effortless confidence on screen while carrying a private life that had been considerably less smooth. Moore had married 4 times. His first 2 relationships, to fellow RADA student Dorn Van Steen and Welsh singer Dorothy Squires, were both volatile, and in his later years he spoke openly about experiencing domestic abuse, a disclosure that quietly reframed the image of the world's most invincible man. His third marriage, to Italian actress Luisa Mattioli, lasted over 2 decades before ending in a divorce, reportedly costing £10 million, one of the most publicized in British legal history. He also harbored a genuine dislike of real firearms, a legacy of a childhood accident that left him blinking involuntarily every time he pulled a trigger on camera. His most significant second act came through UNICEF, where he served as Goodwill Ambassador from 1991 until his death, a calling that grew partly from his battle with prostate cancer in 1993. He died in May 2017 at 89, just a year after losing his stepdaughter Christina to cancer. The quiet grief of a man who had spent decades making the world laugh. Another of his leading ladies from those Bond years carried her own kind of quiet dignity right to the very end. At 15 years old, Lois Maxwell ran away from home and enlisted in the Canadian Women's Army Corps during the Second World War. She was quickly discovered and discharged, but that impulsive act of determined self-invention tells you something about the woman who would spend the next 2 decades playing Miss Moneypenny across 14 Bond films. She was 50 during the filming of The Spy Who Loved Me, the longest-serving woman in the franchise, and one of only 2 cast members who had appeared in every single entry since 1962. Before she reached that milestone, her path had been quietly difficult. Her husband, television executive Peter Marriott, died of a heart attack in 1973, leaving her a widow with 2 young children and limited financial security. She moved the family through Canada and back to the UK, at one point writing a popular advice column for the Toronto Sun under the pseudonym Miss Moneypenny to pay the bills. She lobbied the Bond producers more than once to let her character be promoted to head of MI6 once Roger Moore stepped away. They declined. Her career had opened promisingly with a Golden Globe for Most Promising Newcomer in 1948, earned opposite Ronald Reagan in That Hagen Girl. She spent her final years battling colorectal cancer and died in September 2007 at 80. She never got to play M, but she made Moneypenny feel like the most essential person in the building. The man who followed her into the franchise's mythology communicated everything through silence and steel. Before the metal teeth and the towering frame, Richard Kiel spent his evenings teaching mathematics to night school students in Los Angeles. The man who became Jaws in The Spy Who Loved Me, one of the most recognizable henchmen in cinema history, was 37 during filming, standing at 7'2" due to acromegaly, a hormonal disorder that continued shaping his features throughout his life. The character barely spoke and didn't need to. Those chromium steel teeth were statement enough. What audiences never saw was that Kiel could only bear them in his mouth for roughly 30 seconds at a time. The pain was severe, and the expression that read as menace on screen was frequently the look of a man simply trying not to wince. Away from the set, he was by every account a devoted and gentle presence. He married Diane Rogers in 1974 and remained with her for the rest of his life, raising 4 children in clear contrast to the monster he had made famous. A serious car accident in 1992 left him with head injuries and balance difficulties that required a cane for the remainder of his days, though he continued working without complaint. He found another generation of admirers as the gentle giant Mr. Larson in Happy Gilmore in 1996, and later voiced Vlad in Disney's Tangled. He died in September 2014 at 74, remembered with equal warmth for frightening cinema audiences and for being, in every other room, the kindest person there. From one cult figure to another, the woman who played Stromberg's personal assassin made a choice during the making of this film that would quietly redirect the course of her career. Cubby Broccoli spotted Caroline Munro on a poster for Lamb's Navy Rum and decided immediately that he wanted her for The Spy Who Loved Me. She was 28 during filming, already a celebrated face in Hammer horror and British genre cinema, and the role of Naomi, Stromberg's elegant personal pilot and assassin, gave her an unusual distinction in Bond history. She is widely considered the first woman in the franchise to be directly and unambiguously killed by Bond himself, taken out by a missile to her helicopter. What happened around that casting is equally revealing. At almost the same moment, her agent presented her with an alternative: take Naomi or play Ursa in Superman, 1978. She chose Bond. Sarah Douglas stepped into Ursa and saw her profile rise considerably as a result. Munro has spoken about that decision without bitterness, though it likely shaped the ceiling of her career. What she never compromised on was her personal code. Throughout the height of her fame as a celebrated sex symbol, she consistently refused nude scenes, turning down significant productions including Force 10 from Navarone on exactly those grounds. She was married to American actor Judd Hamilton from 1970 to 1982, and later to director George Dugdale, who died in 2020, a loss she has discussed with real candor. Now 77 and still working, she is one of the most in-demand figures on the convention circuit, with confirmed appearances in 2026, including London and a festival in Slovenia, where she will serve as guest of honor. The man she was made to serve as his pilot brought his own extraordinary history to a role built on cold, aristocratic destruction. In 1944, Kurt Jürgens was arrested by the Gestapo after arguing with a relative of a senior SS officer in a Vienna bar. Labeled politically unreliable, he was sent to a labor camp in Hungary, from which he escaped and hid until the war ended. The man who played Karl Stromberg in The Spy Who Loved Me, the web-fingered shipping magnate who wished to end human civilization and rebuild it beneath the sea, had himself faced the actual machinery of genocide before he was 40. He was 61 during filming, a long-established European star, and brought a weary, aristocratic stillness to Stromberg that made the character feel chillingly detached rather than theatrical. His personal life moved at a very different pace. He married 5 times, often joking that he believed in marriage so deeply that he simply kept returning to the ceremony. One of those marriages, to Hungarian actress Eva Bartók in the mid-1950s, carried its own controversy. Persistent rumors suggested his daughter Diana had actually been fathered by Frank Sinatra, a claim he never confirmed but raised her through regardless. The bitterest irony of his Hollywood career was that he was repeatedly cast as Nazi officers in major productions including The Longest Day and Battle of Britain, despite having risked his life to oppose the actual regime. He suffered multiple severe heart attacks in the 1970s, and during one described looking into what he could only call hell, a vision that he never stopped talking about in interviews. He died in 1982 at 66. The actor who embodied British institutional authority in the same film was carrying, in that same period, the kind of private grief no institution can protect you from. On a January night in 1972, a fire broke out at Bernard Lee's 17th-century home in Kent. His wife Gladys, with whom he had shared nearly 4 decades of life, died in the blaze. Lee tried to reach her through the flames and was hospitalized for smoke inhalation and shock. The actor known to millions as M across 11 Bond films, the gruff and exacting MI6 chief who had anchored the franchise since Dr. No, was 69 during The Spy Who Loved Me and had been carrying that grief for 5 years by the time cameras rolled. In the aftermath, he was also mugged, and the combination of trauma and loss pulled him into a depression that brought with it severe alcoholism. He was unemployed for 2 full years and fell into serious debt. What rescued him was a chance meeting with Richard Burton in a pub. Burton, who had worked with Lee years earlier, looked at his old colleague and understood immediately what he was seeing. He wrote him a check for $6,000 on the spot to clear the debt, saying simply that everyone had a spot of trouble now and then. Lee returned to work, appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, and had been cast in For Your Eyes Only when he died of stomach cancer in 1981. The producers left the role of M entirely vacant in that film as a gesture of respect, rather than replace him. His grandson is the actor Johnny Lee Miller, known to a later generation from Trainspotting and Elementary, carrying the family name into a new era. The next face from this film took a very different path, one that led her from Egyptian film sets to interview subjects few journalists had ever reached. Bisera Vukotic arrived on The Spy Who Loved Me as a relatively little-known figure in European genre cinema, credited on screen under the anglicized name Olga Bisera. Her role as Falika, the Cairo hostess who throws herself in front of a bullet to shield Bond, was designed to be memorable for only a moment. She was 32, born in Mostar in what was then Yugoslavia. trained at the Drama Arts Academy in Belgrade before building a career in Italian productions. Her personal and professional life during this period was closely bound up with Italian producer Luciano Martino, with whom she maintained a long-term relationship and who provided much of her early screen work. The Bond appearance came at what would prove to be a turning point. By the early 1980s, she had stepped away from acting entirely, frustrated by the narrowness of what was being offered. Every role a variation on the same exotic beauty template. What she built in its place is remarkable by any standard. She became a journalist and television producer, leveraging her languages and her contacts to reach subjects that experienced political correspondence rarely accessed. She interviewed King Hussein of Jordan and Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi. Her interview with Muammar Gaddafi was the most striking. On arriving in Libya, her passport was temporarily confiscated, and she navigated the entire encounter under conditions most journalists would have refused to accept. She described it, with considerable understatement, as tense. Now 82 and living in retirement, she made a rare public appearance at the London Film Fair in January 2026 to mark the film's enduring legacy. Desmond Llewelyn was captured in France in 1940 while serving as a second lieutenant in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers and spent the next 5 years in German prisoner of war camps, including Colditz Castle. On one occasion, he discovered a tunnel being dug for escape by fellow prisoners, only to be told he was too tall to use it and would get stuck. The man who became Q in 17 Bond films, the endlessly exasperated quartermaster who handed 007 his gadgets with the resigned patience of a teacher on the last day of term, was 62 during The Spy Who Loved Me and had been playing the role for over a decade. The most cherished irony of his career was that he was completely hopeless with technology. He could not set a digital clock or program a VCR. Every line of technobabble he delivered with such convincing authority had been learned entirely phonetically because he had genuinely no idea what any of the words meant, and he lived in constant quiet dread of going blank mid-scene. His wife Pamela managed all technology in their household, a marriage that had begun in 1938 and lasted 61 years. He never retired and showed no sign of wanting to. On December 19, 1999, he was driving home alone from a fan signing event in East Sussex when his car was involved in a head-on collision. He was airlifted to hospital and died shortly after. He was 85, still showing up for the audience he loved, right to the very last day. Geoffrey Keen played Sir Frederick Grey, the perpetually scandalized Minister of Defense, across 6 Bond films beginning with The Spy Who Loved Me, and he was 60 when cameras rolled, already carrying a career of over 100 screen credits behind him. He came from acting royalty. His father, Malcolm Keen, was a celebrated figure of the British stage and early cinema, and Geoffrey followed him through Bristol Grammar School and into the Old Vic Theatre Company without apparent hesitation. The Bond producers valued him for a quality that is harder to teach than technique. His face did the work before he opened his mouth. A single raised eyebrow communicated more governmental alarm than a page of dialogue. His most celebrated moment in the entire franchise arrives in the final scene of this film, when Bond and Anya are discovered together in an escape pod, and Keen's expression of outraged horror became a small comedy landmark repeated in Bond retrospectives ever since. Despite appearing in Dr. Zhivago, Born Free, The Third Man, and 6 of the highest-grossing films in British history, he was almost never recognized in the street. Character actors of his generation largely accepted that as part of the arrangement. His private life was kept with equal quietness. He married twice over the course of his long life with almost no public record of either relationship. He died in 2005 at 89, remembered most vividly by millions for a single moment of magnificent, indignant silence. Standing at 5 feet 11 inches, Valerie Leon was accustomed to commanding a room before she said a word, and the brief cameo she played as the hotel receptionist in Sardinia made the most of exactly that. She was 33 during filming of The Spy Who Loved Me, already a well-established face across Hammer Horror and the Carry On series, with 6 entries in the latter to her name, and her appearance in 2 separate Bond eras, returning for Never Say Never Again in 1983, places her in a small and select group. Roger Moore made her scene considerably harder to execute than it needed to be, whispering jokes at her just before each take in a sustained campaign to destroy her composure. She has described him as a joker and a gentleman, and Connery, when she worked with him 6 years later, as intense and professional. Her personal life shifted course sharply in 1988 when her husband, television producer Michael Mills, died suddenly. She was 44, left to raise 2 children alone, and made a considered decision to step back from full-time screen work in the years that followed. One of those children, her daughter Merope, became an editor at The Guardian. In later life, Leon channeled her career into a one-woman stage show, Valerie Leon Up Front, touring theaters and cruise ships with stories gathered from a remarkable few decades in British entertainment. Now 82, she remains active, with a confirmed appearance at the London Film Fair in November 2026. Walter Gotell's family left Germany when Hitler came to power because remaining was genuinely dangerous, and he was raised in Britain with an accent that the industry immediately decided sounded threatening. That is how a man whose family had fled Nazism spent several decades being cast as Nazis and Soviet officers, because a German inflection in a post-war British studio meant one thing and one thing only. He was 53 during The Spy Who Loved Me, playing General Anatol Gogol, head of the KGB, a role he made his own across 6 films. The choice he made with Gogol was deliberate and not obvious. He refused to play him as a villain. He built the character as a rival statesman, watchful but not hostile, someone who understood détente as something more than a political arrangement. The dynamic that developed between Gogol and M across multiple films carried a quiet authenticity, 2 professionals on opposite sides who had developed something close to mutual respect. What Bond fans often don't realize is that Gotell had appeared in the franchise 14 years earlier, playing the villain Morzeny in From Russia with Love in 1963, one of very few actors to hold 2 entirely separate major roles across the series. Between productions, he ran a farm in Ireland and maintained various business interests, a pragmatic instinct that ensured he never depended on the industry's unpredictable rhythms. He was married to Yvonne for the whole of his adult life. His health declined sharply in the 1990s, and he died in 1997 at 73. Ian Fleming himself reportedly identified George Baker as the man who should play James Bond before Sean Connery was ever seriously considered. Baker appeared in The Spy Who Loved Me as Captain Benson, a British naval officer with a modest number of scenes, and was 46 during filming, already carrying 3 separate Bond appearances across the franchise as 3 different characters. His most unusual contribution to the series remains largely unknown to casual viewers. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969, he dubbed George Lazenby's voice entirely for the sequences where Bond impersonates the aristocratic Sir Hilary Bray. The voice audiences heard in those scenes, precise, polished, effortlessly upper class, was Baker's, and the craft was seamless enough that most people never registered the substitution. His first marriage to costume designer Julia Squire produced 5 daughters and lasted until her death in 1999. What followed was one of the quieter love stories of his career. He married actress Louis Ramsey in 1993, the same woman who had played his wife in the long-running television series The Ruth Rendell Mysteries. The fictional partnership became a real one, and it sustained the final chapter of his life. When Ramsey died in early 2011, he deteriorated quickly. He died later that same year. In the early 1980s, before Inspector Wexford brought him his belated television fame, he had been close to bankruptcy and seriously considered abandoning acting altogether to become a landscape gardener. 5 times over 15 years, Michael Billington sat across from the Bond producers and tested for the role of 007. 5 times, the part went to someone else. His role as Sergei Barsov in The Spy Who Loved Me, the Russian agent and lover of Major Anya Amasova who is killed by Bond in the film's pre-title ski sequence, carried a particular sting that Billington himself acknowledged freely. He was being shot on screen by the man who had won. He was 35 during filming, a quietly compelling presence who had built a cult following as Colonel Paul Foster in the science fiction series UFO, and producer Cubby Broccoli's decision to cast him as Sergei was understood by everyone on set as a kind of consolation, keeping him inside the franchise while the lead remained beyond reach. His relationship with Barbara Broccoli, Cubby's daughter and the woman who now oversees the entire Bond operation, added another dimension to his position, fueling persistent speculation that he was being held in reserve should Roger Moore ever walk away during contract negotiations. The waiting, stretched across more than a decade, became its own kind of erosion. He described the constant speculation as psychologically exhausting and eventually moved to Hollywood, studying with Lee Strasberg before gradually stepping back from performing to write and teach. He penned the screenplay for The Silver Dream Racer in 1980, married Catherine Christoph in 1988, and had one son. He died in 2005 at 63, the most frequently tested Bond in history, who never actually played the role. Nadim Sawalha played Aziz Fekish in The Spy Who Loved Me, the Cairo middleman who attempts to sell a stolen microfilm and is eventually caught and killed by Jaws in the shadow of the pyramids. He was around 41 during filming, a Jordanian-born actor who had arrived in Britain from a Christian Bedouin family in Madaba, and his presence in a major Bond production was itself a quiet landmark at a time when Middle Eastern characters were routinely played by Western actors in heavy makeup. He had worked for the BBC Arabic service before turning to performance, and in his early British career was often compelled to adopt a fake Indian accent simply to be considered for parts, because the industry had constructed no real category for Arab actors within its casting system. That compromise was not something he forgot. He returned to the franchise in The Living Daylights in 1987, and in his 70s delivered one of his most acclaimed performances in Captain Abu Raed, the first independently produced Jordanian feature film in decades, winning Best Actor recognition that reflected a talent the industry had spent years misusing. He has been married to Roberta Lane for over 50 years. His daughters are actress Julia Sawalha, known to millions as Safi in Absolutely Fabulous, and television presenter Nadia Sawalha of EastEnders and Loose Women. He suffered a stroke in later life, recovered, and returned to work. Now around 91, he lives quietly in London. Julia recently described him as frail but mentally sharp, still fully present. Barbara Bach was 29 when she played Major Anya Amasova in The Spy Who Loved Me, and she made her feelings about the project known with unusual directness. In press interviews at the time of release, she described James Bond as a male chauvinist pig who used women as human shields. The character she was playing had been written specifically as Bond's equal, a highly trained KGB major who saves him as often as he saves her, and Bach brought a cool, self-possessed authority to the role that made that parody genuinely credible on screen. Born Barbara Goldbach in New York, she had built a modeling career in Europe and married Italian businessman Augusto Gregorini in 1968, with whom she had 2 children before they divorced shortly after the film's release. The next chapter began on the set of the 1981 comedy Caveman, where she met Ringo Starr. They married that year and in April 2026 celebrated their 45th anniversary. Her sister Marjorie is married to Joe Walsh of the Eagles, which makes Ringo Starr and Joe Walsh brothers-in-law, a rock royalty family connection of genuinely extraordinary proportions. In the late 1980s, both she and Starr were deep in alcoholism and cocaine addiction. They entered a rehabilitation clinic in Tucson, Arizona together in 1988, have been sober ever since, and speak openly about how that shared recovery kept them both alive. She earned a master's degree in psychology from UCLA in 1993 and co-founded the Lotus Foundation with Ringo, supporting substance abuse recovery and survivors of domestic violence. Now 78, she travels with him on his all-star band tours, a long way in every sense from the woman who called 007 a chauvinist on the 1977 press circuit. His gone father gave Edward de Souza the kind of ambiguous appearance that the British film industry of the 1960s and 70s treated as an infinitely adjustable resource, and it was that quality that eventually brought him to The Spy Who Loved Me as Sheikh Hossein, Bond's witty Cambridge-educated friend in Egypt, a character written deliberately to subvert the usual exoticism by being the most composed and perceptive person in every scene. He was 44 during filming, a RADA graduate with a flawless RP accent who had spent his career being fitted into whichever nationality a script required, rather than being seen for what he actually was. The role of Hossein was quietly notable for refusing that pattern. He had been a genuine romantic lead in Hammer's The Phantom of the Opera in 1962, playing the hero opposite Herbert Lom, and holds a singular distinction in Doctor Who history. He led Mission to the Unknown in 1965, the only episode in over 60 years of the program to feature no doctor and no companions whatsoever. When actor David Graham died in 2024, de Souza became the last surviving credited member of that remarkable serial. He has been married to actress Miranda Connell, a former presenter on Play School, since the 1960s, a partnership now stretching past 60 years. In his later career, he found a new audience through audio drama and voice work, including the Golden Compass adaptations. Now 93 years old, he is one of the oldest living figures connected to the Bond franchise, and remains exactly what Hossein always was in this film, the most composed person in a very crowded room.